The notification came through at 11:47 on a Saturday morning. I know the exact time because I'd just taken a screenshot of it to send to my best friend, the way you do when something so absurd happens that you need a witness to confirm you didn't imagine it. My sister had posted a video to the family group chat. 43 seconds of my nephew blowing out candles on a Batman cake, my mom and dad clapping in the background, my brother-in-law filming sideways the way he always does, and my grandmother in the corner wearing the good cardigan she only takes out for occasions. The caption read, "Robbie's 5th birthday. So glad we could all be here." I had defended my master's thesis in mechanical engineering 4 hours earlier. Nobody had texted. Nobody had called. The group chat had been quiet all morning while I stood in the conference room at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and answered questions about thermal stress modeling and aerospace components for 40 minutes straight. My committee had signed off before noon. My advisor, Dr. Parrish, had shaken my hand and said, with the specific restraint of someone who gives compliments like they cost money, that was one of the cleaner defenses I've seen in 12 years. I drove home in my interview blazer with a parking ticket on my windshield and a text from my mom that said, "Sorry we missed it, honey. Robbie's party was today, and you know how Kayla gets with the planning. How did it go?" I sat in my car in the driveway of my apartment building for a long time before I went inside. Let me back up, because the birthday party is not really the beginning. It's just the moment I finally stopped looking away from something I had been refusing to name for years. I grew up in Dearborn, Michigan, the middle child between my older sister Kayla and my younger brother Tyler. Kayla is 10 years older than me and got married at 24 and had Robbie at 26. And by the time I was in high school, she had built a life that gave my parents something immediate and visible to love. Soccer schedules and school plays and holidays full of a small child who called them Grandma and Grandpa, and meant it completely. I don't say this to fault her. Kayla is not a villain. She's just someone whose life happened to be easier for my parents to see. My dad worked 30 years at a Ford assembly plant and took early retirement with a pension and a bad knee. My mom did bookkeeping part-time for a dental office. Neither of them went to college, which is not a judgment, just context. Because I think it's relevant to understanding why my choices sometimes felt, to them, like a commentary on theirs. I was the first in my family to finish a 4-year degree. I was the first to go to graduate school. Both of those things were treated, at home, less like achievements and more like decisions that required explanation. When I got into Michigan's graduate engineering program, my dad said, "That's more school?" My mom said she was proud but followed it immediately with a concern about student loans that pivoted within 2 sentences into a story about Kayla's new kitchen backsplash. When Tyler got promoted to shift supervisor at the warehouse he worked at in Westland, my parents took the whole family to dinner at Applebee's. It was a Thursday. My dad gave a little toast. I kept track of these things the way people do when they're trying to decide if a pattern is real or imagined, filling a spreadsheet in the back of my mind that I never wanted to look at directly, because looking at it directly would require admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. My thesis defense was on a Saturday because that was the date my committee could align on. I had told my parents 6 weeks out. I put it in the family group chat with the address of the building and the start time and a note that said guests could wait in the hall outside the conference room, and I'd come out afterward. My mom had reacted with a heart emoji. My dad had said, "Good luck, kiddo." Tyler had sent a thumbs up. Kayla had not responded because Kayla treats the group chat like ambient noise. 2 weeks before the defense, my mom mentioned that Robbie's birthday was the same day. I said I knew. She said Kayla had already booked the party venue. I said I understood, but the thesis date couldn't move. She said she was sure it would all work out. It worked out exactly the way the spreadsheet in the back of my mind had been predicting for years. After I went inside my apartment and changed out of my blazer and made myself eat something, a bowl of cereal because I hadn't gone grocery shopping, I did something I had been resisting for a long time. I opened that mental spreadsheet and I looked at it. My college graduation, my parents came but left before the reception because Tyler had a baseball game. He was 15. My first engineering internship offer junior year, my mom said that was great, and then asked if I was still going to be home for Christmas. My dad said the company name and then said he thought they were doing layoffs. The paper I co-authored with Dr. Parrish that got published in an aerospace engineering journal, I told my parents at dinner. My dad asked if that meant I got paid extra. My mom asked if I wanted more chicken. The thesis defense, a Batman birthday cake. I'm not telling you this to generate sympathy. I'm telling you this because when I finally looked at the whole list at once, sitting on my kitchen floor in socks eating cereal at 2 in the afternoon after the best professional moment of my life, I understood something I should have understood earlier. This was not going to change. Not with more time, not with more achievement, not with more patience. The distance between what I needed from my family and what they were able to give was not a gap that was closing. It was a fixed measurement. I had just refused to take it honestly. I finished the cereal. I applied for a job. It wasn't quite that linear, but almost. I had been in conversation with an aerospace engineering firm in Seattle for 3 months, Meridian Aerosystems, a mid-sized contractor that did structural analysis work for commercial aviation. The position was a junior stress analysis engineer, which was precisely the work my thesis had been building toward. I had been stalling on their final offer because Seattle was far, because leaving felt, somehow, like giving up on a version of the future where my family eventually understood what I had built. I emailed my contact at Meridian that evening. I said I was in. I could start in 8 weeks. I told my parents in a phone call 2 days later. My mom said Seattle was so far. My dad asked if the winters were bad, which was actually a question about Michigan winters, which he loves and considers a character-building feature of human existence. I said I was excited about the position. My mom asked if Kayla knew. I said I hadn't told Kayla yet. There was a pause, the kind that in my family functions as an entire sentence, and my mom moved on to asking about whether I'd need to sell my furniture. I moved in October. My best friend Renata helped me load the U-Haul and we drove to her apartment afterward, and she fed me pasta and didn't make me talk, which is the specific kindness that I think about most when I think about that week. My first year in Seattle was hard and good in equal measure, which is the only honest way to describe starting over somewhere new at 28. Meridian was structured, demanding, and run by people who treated competence as the baseline expectation rather than a surprise. My direct supervisor was a woman named Connie who had been doing stress analysis for commercial aircraft for 19 years and communicated primarily through annotated engineering drawings and the occasional dry observation about regulatory paperwork. She told me 6 months in, while we were both staring at a load path model on her monitor, "You're going to be good at this." That was the longest compliment she gave anyone. I wrote it in my notebook. I found a neighborhood. I found a coffee shop I liked. I found a hiking trail that I did every Sunday morning when the weather allowed, which in Seattle is a more conditional statement than it sounds. I started to feel like a person who had been built for a particular environment and had finally found it, the way some plants need specific soil. 14 months after I moved to Seattle, Meridian was awarded a federal contract to conduct independent structural safety assessments for a fleet of regional commuter aircraft, 47 planes operated by a carrier called Pacific Regional Air. They serviced smaller airports across the Pacific Northwest and parts of Alaska, routes that connected communities where air travel wasn't recreational but essential, fishing towns, logging communities, places where the road in was 3 hours of mountain driving. I was assigned to the wing attachment assessment, which is exactly what it sounds like. Whether the wings were attached correctly and would remain that way under the stresses of the routes these planes actually flew. I worked the numbers for 11 weeks. I ran the models 3 separate ways to make sure I wasn't seeing something that wasn't there. I was seeing something that was there. Specifically, 14 of the 47 aircraft had a maintenance documentation pattern that created ambiguity around inspection intervals for a specific component of the wing attachment hardware. This was not a guaranteed failure. I want to be precise about that because precision matters more than drama in engineering. It was a documented uncertainty in the maintenance record that, under a specific combination of load conditions and inspection timing, created a risk window that our assessment guidelines required us to flag. I flagged it. What happened next was less straightforward than I expected, and I think about this part often, because it revealed something about how systems work that my thesis, for all its technical rigor, had not covered. Pacific Regional Air's maintenance director pushed back. Not aggressively, but steadily. He said our interpretation of the documentation gap was overly conservative. He said the aircraft had been flying these routes safely for years. He said if we flagged this formally to the FAA, the carrier would need to ground the planes for re-inspection, which would disrupt service to communities that had no other options for weeks. That last part was true. It was also not an engineering argument. Connie called me into her office after the third meeting with Pacific Regional's team. She said, "Tell me where you're at." I said I was at the flag stands. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Okay. Write it up cleanly. I'll sign it." I wrote it up. Connie signed it. We submitted our findings to the FAA with full documentation. The re-inspection took 19 days. Of the 14 flagged aircraft, 3 required corrective maintenance before they were cleared to return to service. The work on those 3 planes took another 11 days after the re-inspection. 30 total days of reduced service for Pacific Regional. No planes went down. No one got hurt. That is the ending of a safety assessment story when it goes correctly. An absence, a non-event, a thing that did not happen because someone caught it first. I did not expect what came after. One of the communities served by Pacific Regional Air was a small city in Alaska called Rangel, about 2,000 people. The carrier ran 3 flights a week in and out, connecting residents to Juneau and Ketchikan. During the 30 days of reduced service, Pacific Regional rerouted what they could, but Rangel lost direct service for 18 of those days. The mayor of Rangel wrote a public letter expressing frustration. A local news station in Juneau ran a segment. Pacific Regional's PR team issued a statement referencing required federal safety compliance procedures. The safety compliance procedures were my report. I didn't know any of this was happening until my dad called me. My dad almost never called me. We communicated primarily through the family group chat and occasional texts where he forwarded me weather news about Michigan as if I had asked. He called on a Tuesday afternoon and I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the pattern. I answered. He said he'd seen something on Facebook. A post about those Alaska flights being grounded. Someone had shared it with a comment about government overreach and unnecessary regulation. My dad said he'd read the whole thread and he said, almost carefully, "That was your company, wasn't it? That assessment?" I said yes. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "So you found something?" I said yes. I explained as plainly as I could what the flag meant and what it didn't mean. I told him 3 planes had needed corrective maintenance. I told him the disruption to Rangel was real and unfortunate, and also that the alternative was leaving a documented risk unaddressed on aircraft serving remote communities with limited emergency infrastructure. My dad was quiet for longer this time. Then he said, "Huh." Then he said, "That sounds like hard work." I sat with that sentence for a moment. That sounds like hard work. It was not, "I'm proud of you." It was not an apology for the birthday cake or the thesis defense or the chicken dinner or any of it, but it was my father, a man who communicates in short sentences and football scores, saying that he had looked at what I did and recognized it as something real. It was the most direct acknowledgement he had given me in 31 years. I said, "It was." He said, "You doing okay out there?" I said yes. He said to call if I needed anything. Then he hung up, because my dad ends calls the way he exits rooms, abruptly and without fanfare. I put my phone down on my desk and looked out the window at the Seattle skyline going gray in the late afternoon. I didn't feel vindicated. That's important to say accurately because the version of this story where I felt vindicated would be cleaner and also false. What I felt was something smaller and more complicated, like a door that had been stuck for a very long time had moved, just slightly. Not open, just moved. My mom called 3 days later. Her call was longer and harder to navigate. She said she'd heard I'd been involved in grounding those planes in Alaska. I said involved was technically accurate. She said people in the Facebook comments were saying the government was being too strict. I said, the FAA sets the safety thresholds, not me, and my job was to assess against those thresholds accurately. She said she just hoped I hadn't made things harder for those people in Alaska than they needed to be. I said, I hope the same thing. I also said that 3 aircraft had needed repairs, and that those aircraft now had correctly documented maintenance records, and that the pilots and passengers on those planes were better served by that outcome than by the alternative. She said, well, you always did know a lot about these things. That is not a compliment, but it is the closest my mother comes to one when she's not entirely sure she agrees with what you did. I have learned to receive it as such. The month after the FAA review closed, Beridian received a commendation letter from the FAA's regional office acknowledging the quality of our assessment documentation. Connie forwarded it to the team with a single line, "Good work." She printed a copy and pinned it to the bulletin board outside her office. It stayed there for 8 months until someone else's commendation went up beside it. I did not send my parents the letter. I thought about it. I decided against it. The gesture would have been for me, not for them. A way of saying, look, 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 to people who had spent years looking in other directions. I was tired of wanting them to look. My sister Kayla texted me in November. We had been in occasional contact, birthday acknowledgments, holiday check-ins, the maintenance messages of people who care about each other, in theory, more than in practice. Her text said she'd heard about the Alaska thing from my parents. She said it sounded like a big deal. She said she was proud of me and she was sorry she hadn't said that more. I read that text 4 times. I looked for the qualifier, the pivot, the but. It wasn't there. I wrote back that it meant a lot. Because it did. Kayla is not a villain. She's someone whose life required a different kind of attention than mine, and who benefited from a family architecture that was built before I arrived and that none of us designed consciously. She said sorry in a text message with a typo in it, without fanfare, and I believed her. Tyler sent me a meme about engineers 3 weeks later. It was his way of saying the same thing. My family is not repaired. I want to be honest about that because the resolution that feels emotionally satisfying. Everyone apologizes, the pattern breaks, we all gather at Christmas understanding each other better. That is not what happened. What happened was smaller and more durable. My dad made 1 phone call and said 4 sentences that cost him something. My sister said sorry in November with a typo. My brother sent a meme. My mom said I always did know a lot about these things. None of that undoes a thesis defense with no one in the hall, but I have stopped needing it to. I bought a house plant last spring. This is not a metaphor. I actually bought a plant, a pothos, which the nursery worker told me was the most forgiving plant available for people who don't know what they're doing yet. I keep it on the windowsill above my kitchen sink. I forget to water it sometimes. It survives anyway. There's something I find reassuring about that, about a living thing that persists without requiring perfect conditions. I hike the same trail on Sunday mornings. I drink coffee at the same shop. I do work that is technical and demanding and genuinely matters, in the specific way that engineering matters. Quietly, invisibly, in the non-events that don't make news because nothing went wrong. Connie promoted me last spring to project lead on a new assessment contract. She told me in her office on a Wednesday afternoon, sliding a folder across her desk without ceremony. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank her. She just didn't want to train someone new." That's as warm as Connie gets, and I have learned to receive that too. I called my dad that evening. Not to report the promotion, just to call. He answered. We talked about the weather in Michigan and the Tigers' season, and before he hung up he said, "You good?" I said yes. He said, "Good." He hung up. Here's what I want to leave you with, because this story doesn't have a clean ending, and I've made my peace with that. For a long time, I believed that if I achieved enough, clearly enough, loudly enough, the people I loved would eventually be able to see me, that the distance between us was a function of my own visibility, that I just needed to be more obvious, more present in their field of view. What I understand now is that I was confusing 2 different problems. The first problem was that my family had a limited vocabulary for the kind of work I did and the life I was building. The second problem was that I had made their comprehension a condition of my own progress. The first problem was theirs. The second one was mine. The pathos is still alive. The trail is still there on Sunday mornings. The work continues, careful and unglamorous and necessary. I don't need the standing ovation. I just needed to stop waiting for it before I moved. So I'll ask you what I keep asking myself in the quiet mornings before the city wakes up. What have you been building in your own life that deserves to be seen, regardless of who's watching? And what would it look like to keep building it anyway? I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that Saturday in Ann Arbor. Not in any mystical sense. Just the plain, observable kind. The kind where choices compound quietly over years until one morning you're sitting on a kitchen floor eating cereal after the best day of your professional life, and you finally see the whole shape of something you'd been refusing to look at directly. My family didn't miss my thesis defense because they were careless people. They missed it because they had spent years practicing a particular kind of attention, and I had spent years allowing it. Every time I lowered my own expectations to close the gap between what I hoped for and what arrived, I was teaching everyone around me that the gap was acceptable. That is not blame. That is just how it works. The patterns we tolerate become the patterns we live inside. What I did, moving to Seattle, taking the job at Meridian, throwing myself into work that was demanding and unglamorous and genuinely mattered. None of that was revenge. I want to be honest about that because revenge would have required me to stay emotionally attached to the outcome. What I did was closer to the opposite. I stopped making my family's comprehension a condition of my own forward motion. That shift is smaller than it sounds and harder than it sounds in equal measure. The ethics question in my work, flagging those 14 aircraft, holding the assessment against pushback from Pacific Regional, that one was actually easier than the family question. Engineering has standards. You run the numbers, you document the uncertainty. You report what you find. Integrity in a technical context has a clear procedural definition. Integrity in a personal context is murkier. It doesn't come with a checklist. It just requires you to keep asking, honestly, whether the choices you're making match the person you're trying to be. Connie never praised me for anything that wasn't earned. That's one of the things I've learned from watching how she operates, that real respect is specific. It doesn't arrive on a schedule or apportion to how much you need it. It arrives when you've done something that warranted it. My dad calling me about those Alaska flights, saying that sounds like hard work, that was specific. It was small and it was real and it meant something precisely because it wasn't automatic. Resilience, I think, is mostly just the willingness to continue in the absence of applause, not bitterly. Not as martyrdom, just quietly, because the work is worth doing regardless. The pothos on my windowsill survives because it doesn't require perfect conditions. It just needs enough. I've been trying to learn that from a houseplant, which feels a little absurd to admit. But here we are. What I know now is this. The life you build when you stop waiting for permission is the only one that actually belongs to you. It's not always the warmest or the loudest or the most celebrated, but it's solid in a way that borrowed validation never is. And on Sunday mornings on the trail with the city still quiet and the coffee still hot, solid is more than enough.